All right, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Professor Brenton Boyce, and this is Philosophy 408. 408. This is Human Rights and the Law. Uh, Today, I will be discussing from my textbook, Chapter 5. Our textbook is The Evolution of International Human Rights, Vision Seen, third edition by Paul Gordon Loren. Um, Today, we're going to discuss Chapter 5, which is entitled A People's War, the Crusade for World War II. All right, as an introduction to the chapter, now the chapter is broken down into four parts, and I'll discuss each subsection of the chapter, but we'll begin with the introduction. The trauma of World War II shook the world at its very foundations. Never before in human history had any armed conflict resulted in so many deaths, such massive devastation, or so much global upheaval. For 6 brutal years, this total war extended to most parts of the world, consumed the financial and material resources developed over generations, ignited what many called an international race war, fanned hatreds that produced horrifying genocide, mobilized science and the mysteries of the atom into instruments of mass destruction, and exposed entire populations of people to horrifying death. More civilians lost their lives than soldiers. I repeat that. More civilians lost their lives than soldiers. That means there were more people that were not in battle that lost their lives than those who were. Um, the war was the great equalizer because it required the total mobilization of all resources, which brought about an emergence and even a liberation of many victims previously subjected to race, gender, or class discrimination, as well as smaller nations and colonial populations. What that means it kind of became an all hands on deck situation where um, for the success of this war, everyone had to be involved. There was no leaving anyone on the sidelines. Everyone had to be involved. So those that were normally left out of situations had to be called upon to participate. What that does in turn is now it creates expectations, right? We're going to talk more about that. So the first subsection of the chapter is broken down into four subsections. The first subsection is war, genocide, and self-reflections. When World War II began in 1939, only the most idealistic few could possibly hold out any hope for the future of human rights. The aggressors of World War II, or who we call the Axis powers, operated nearly at will. You had Nazi Germany, led by Hitler. Not the Nazis crushed Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France, and they also began a bombing campaign against Great Britain. Yes, they were using ballistic missiles, or not ballistic missiles, but missiles at that time. So they were using rocket propulsion as a tool in war. They were the first military or first country to use that technology in the military. But they were bombing Britain. Nazis also assisted Benito Mussolini in Italy in the territorial conquest of Yugoslavia, Greece, Crete, and North Africa. In 1941, Hitler, who was already fighting everyone to his west, turned on the neighbor to his east and began to fight Russia. In 1941, Hitler invaded Russia and also declared war by way of extermination. Killing squads lined up people by the thousands and killed them in mass graves. Hitler assigned Heinrich Himmler as leader of the SS, or some call them stormtroopers, but they were like the secret military faction or military part of the military who had special assignments. and gave Himmler the power to engage in the extermination of Jews. Or it was extermination of Jews, degenerate-looking Orientals. And this is in quotes. So the extermination of Jews, degenerate-looking Orientals, Slavs, and others deemed to be racially inferior. Death camps were opened up, such as Auschwitz, Kelmno, Belzec, Sobibor, Majdanek, and Treblinka, among others. Also, part of the Axis powers was Japan. Japan invaded other Asian nations. Germans' conquest of the Netherlands and France, and the absorption of Britain in their own into their own survival, left their Asian colonies open for Japanese conquest. So, of course, with Hitler and his and of course the Axis powers who were already in the war before Japan entered, once they begin the war and start fighting off the Allied powers, and that's essentially what we call the good guys. America wasn't in the war yet. America didn't enter the war until 1941, around December of 1941, and we'll talk about that as well. But before that point, Germany had kind of caused all these other countries to kind of pool all their resources and go all hands on deck, which essentially made them turn their backs on their colonial possessions in Asia. When that happened, of course, Japan saw these colonies and these places that were no longer inhabited or colonized by the French and who else? The French and of course in the Netherlands and other countries. They said it's right for the taking. We're now going to invade, and that's exactly what they did. Japan invaded Indochina and Thailand, attacking innocent civilians. The only power standing in the way of Japan's conquest of the Philippines, Burma, Singapore, the Malay Peninsula, and Indonesia was a very uncertain United States. So, of course, before December 41, at this point, the war has now been going on for almost 2 years. America is not yet in the war. So, at this point, America doesn't have a dog in the fight. They're kind of bankrolling or helping Britain, but they don't put anything physically into the war. They don't put troops on the ground, and they don't actually go in and fight. They're just kind of bankrolling an ally. So they're kind of sitting on the sides, and what Japan wants to complete their total conquest of Asia, all of Asia. But there were a few colonial possessions that America had, and America was sitting there watching it and didn't jump right in. But America was the only thing that stood in the way at this point of Japan taking over all of Asia. Let's see here. Okay. The United States had kind of an isolationist policy, meaning they didn't want to be involved in another war. They had just ended a war in 1918, the First World War, and they said, "Hey, we're going to let if people have fights, we're going to let them solve their problems on their own, and we're not going to get into it." So they had isolationist policies since the Paris Peace Conference that ended. Of course, as I just said, that ended World War I over 20 years earlier. The U.S. refused to join the League of Nations and had obstructed a number of international human rights efforts. The military success of the Axis powers shattered the idea that the U.S. could just sit out of global affairs. So at this point, at the beginning of the war, you have Japan, who's taken over Asia pretty much without opposition. They're just running through Asia, taking it over. And then you also have the Axis powers that are in Europe that are taking over Europe. Germany and Italy, they're taking over Europe. You had other countries that had like kind of fascist revolutions as well. But Europe is kind of being absorbed in war. And at this point, it's only a matter of time before America has to enter. So President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, you'll hear me say FDR as an abbreviation, began serious self-reflection and was forced to formulate a response to Japan's activity, or just the activity of the Axis powers in general. Under Secretary of State Sumner Welles, Under Secretary of State Sumner Welles was assigned the task of fact finding. Welles would soon work hard to promote human rights during the war. He reported to FDR, of the president, that he noted an increased absence in world security. President Roosevelt proclaimed that he sought to secure 4 essential human freedoms: the freedom of speech and expression, the freedom of worship, the freedom from want, and the freedom from fear. Or freedom from fear. Roosevelt was aware that the United States wanted to remain non-combatant, but he wanted to create a relationship with Britain. And this is what I talked about, where they were kind of bankrolling Britain. In August of 1941, Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain, met on a ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Together, they discussed the details of the United States serving as an arsenal of democracy, of the land lease assistance of Britain and Russia, who were engulfed in the war, and of strategies to combat aggressors in Europe, North Africa, and Asia. They also assisted or issued an 8-point declaration known as the Atlantic Charter. And this was the most famous result of this meeting, or the most famous outcome of this meeting, was the Atlantic Charter. Let's see here, sorry. But it was the Atlantic Charter. So, of course, part of the Atlantic Charter, certain things they wanted to get out, they wanted to kind of progress, was first and foremost the freedom of trade and of the seas. Also the right of peoples to choose the form of government under which they live. So countries, newly, I guess, liberated countries' ability to be sovereign and choose and have self-determination in determining their own government. Also the right to improved labor standards, the right to economic advancement and social security in all nations, and the right to live with freedom and want, or with the freedom from the want from want and fear. So, in other words, that everyone would have enough and not be hungry or needy, and also they would live without fear. So, leaders of the 2 powerful nations, and this is United States and Great Britain, and this is Roosevelt and Churchill, put the leaders of 2 powerful nations publicly speaking out on behalf of individual rights rather than only the traditional interests and prerogatives of nation states, and emphasizing that these rights applied within as well as across national borders, was a positive step, and it was revolutionary for the time. Because if you remember World War I, at the end, everyone was all about what they wanted to keep, all about national sovereignty and not telling other countries what to do. So there was little to no advancement in human rights. But this looked to be a step in the right direction. This charter became the rallying cry for forces around the globe and would eventually bind together the United Nations. It immediately received the endorsement of the International Labor Organization and other non-governmental organizations. It impressed 2 New Zealand leaders with strong religious and labor backgrounds that would soon make significant contributions to human rights far out of proportion to the size of their country. And these 2 people included Peter Fraser and Walter Nash. This also impressed a young black lawyer in South Africa named Nelson Mandela. Yes, Nelson Mandela was around at this point. He would have been in his late 20s or 30s at this point. So he was around a long time. He got to see a lot. Not all reactions to the Atlantic Charter were so enthusiastic, however. Of course, we know the enemies, the Axis powers, didn't like it, right? But outside of the obvious opposition of the Axis powers, there were others that kind of questioned it, and as you could say, they were kind of cynical because of what happened um, when they tried to create some type of charter or organization to enforce peace and human rights before at the end of World War I. So because it failed then, a lot of people were kind of questioning it. Isolationists, those that wanted to stay out of war, asked how could the president commit to such a declaration without drawing the country into war. Um, those and then you have that. So you have isolationists. Then you have those with vested interests, or those with interest in colonizing. Right. Those with vested interests asked, how could pledges for liberalized trading practices be given without jeopardizing protective tariffs, or for improved labor standards and social security without spreading dangerous socialism. Third, you had skeptics, just general skeptics that asked what was the value of declarations without legally binding commitment. So you had opposition of people that were questioning this charter from different angles. You also had others that asked if these principles apply to the domestic laws of racial segregation, or immigration restrictions based on race in the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. So there were a lot of questions coming. You had isolationists, you had those who had interest, vested interest, in keeping the status quo. You also had skeptics that believed that, in other words, how is this going to be enforced, or how you're going to enforce it. And then you also had those who were essentially pointing out the hypocrisy of um, their domestic governance and what they were doing as far as violating rights in their own countries, and then now trying to get out here and say or talk about or make other countries enforce human rights in other countries, right? So um, Japan. So this was kind of where we are in 1941, August of 1941, and then a few months later, from August to December. So we're talking 4 months. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. The United States Congress immediately declared war against Japan, and then Germany and Italy subsequently. Um, the United States found itself engulfed in another world war. For that moment, the military advantage remained with the Japanese. They had some momentum, so they were taking over Asia. They had destroyed a lot of the Pacific Fleet in their attack on Pearl Harbor. So America, for lack of better analogy, was caught with their pants down. So they weren't able to defend themselves, and they kind of had to build at this point and to catch up to what Japan had done with them or to them, and what they had taken at that point. Japan's invasion of the Philippines led to staggering brutality against captured combatants and civilians. Japan's conquest also included Singapore, Burma, Sumatra, Java, Borneo, New Guinea, Wake, and Guam, and they seemed poised to invade India, Australia, New Zealand, and Alaska if they chose. So they were trying to take over the Pacific Ocean, everything in the Pacific. In order to mobilize all the resources necessary to mount a people's war against the Axis powers, 26 different nations agreed to sign the Declaration of the United Nations on January 1st, 1941. Here, the United States, Russia, Britain, and China joined with Canada, Haiti, Cuba, India, New Zealand, South Africa, among many others, and making a highly public pledge. They promised to devote their full resources to World War II, to refrain from signing any separate agreement with their enemies, and to adhere to the principles of the Atlantic Charter. 46 nations signed and joined. So it's 46 against like 3 or 4 nations that already kind of had a head start. Okay. So of course, they solemnly pledged to preserve human rights and justice in their own lands as well as other lands. Um, the Allies had to look in the mirror also and notice not only the similarities between them and the Axis powers, or I'm sorry, not only the differences between them and the Axis powers, but also the similarities between them and the Axis power. So they had, so they also had to look at themselves and say, hey, we're doing some stuff that's kind of Axis like. We have racism and we have Jim Crow in America, just like they have racism and the Holocaust going on in Germany, right? So they had to take a look, at themselves, had to look in the mirror. Also, in December of 1942, this is a full year after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The Nazis at the Wannsee Conference determined to step up their plan of systematic genocide. Within a few weeks, the first group of Jews arrived at Auschwitz and Belzec. Even propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels described the program as barbaric, and he was pretty much the propaganda man, the man that created commercials, and all the public. What would I say? What's a good word? I guess propaganda is the perfect word, but the press junkets and everything, the radio broadcast and everything that was anti-Semitic, that was essentially saying, where people of Germany, it's the Jewish people's fault that we're here and we want to exterminate them. So he created that propaganda. So he was definitely a part of the war machine, or the Holocaust machine. And he even agreed that this is about to be pretty bad. It's about to be a lot of killing. They rounded up those who they regarded as less than fully human in France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Norway, Austria, Italy, Poland, Russia, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Greece. They crammed them into cattle cars and sent them to concentration camps. It is estimated that as many as 11 million human beings were killed, including Jews, homosexuals, Slavs, prisoners of war, communists, members of the German resistance, the handicapped, Roma, and Jehovah's Witnesses, including and also other racial minorities, so blacks as well. So they killed a little bit of everybody. We always hear the number of 6 million Jews, but there were actually 11 million total people killed. It's just that 6 million of those 11 million were Jewish. Japan also participated in genocide. Despite their efforts at the World War I peace conference, leaders of Japan declared their own racial superiority. This prejudice extended to non-Japanese as well as Caucasians. So, of course, some of the motivation, and allow me to take some liberties with this, but if you think about what happened at the end of World War I, when Japan essentially walked into Paris with all the racial minorities on their back saying, hey, what about human rights? What about making sure that we hold countries accountable? And what about equal protection under the laws? What about not having any discrimination and racial equality? When that didn't go well, you can think, Japan was probably like, wow, these people are hypocrites, and now we're part of this. So they walked out of the first peace conference as an ally, and essentially walked into World War II, fighting essentially the same countries they were just in peace talks with, and that it was just cool with. But it wasn't cool because, of course, they realized that they had been fighting with and beside people that didn't care about minorities and didn't care, only cared about essentially the furtherance of white supremacy and global colonization. So that kind of, I would say, it kind of sculpted the attitude of Japan going forth. They essentially had this hatred for American and European colonization in Asia, and they wanted to rid Asia of everything white, and rid Asia of everything that helped the white, right? So any countries that gave up easily or surrendered, of course, they were taken over, and they were like, hey, we're no longer white. If you're a part of that, we're going to exterminate you. Essentially, that's what they were saying. So these attitudes produce horrendous brutality and human rights abuses by Japanese troops against prisoners of war and civilians alike, in the form of forced labor, biological warfare experiments, sex slave trade and rape, mutilations, and murder. Japan was motivated by the highly emotional issue of racial pride and the fight against white peril. In other words, as I just said before, they wanted everything white out of Asia. The war was a battle of East versus West to liberate Asia from white invasion and oppression. Their victories were viewed as humiliations against the Americans, British, French, and Dutch. So they had a different motivation, right? So they were Axis powers, so they were fighting alongside the evil people in Europe. They were fighting alongside of them, but they didn't have anything in common with them, right? Other than the fact that Germany and Italy kind of creating a war in Europe pulled everybody away and their attention away from Asia and allowed Japan to run unfettered and do what they wanted to do. So of course, with doing that, that made them a natural ally. But Japan hated them, and Germany, if the tables were turned, probably would have turned to Asia and started exterminating, everything in Asia as well, right? But it is what it is. They were allied. They were essentially Axis power allies. So of course, when Japan got victories, their motivation was the fact that they wanted to embarrass the Western powers. They wanted to embarrass everything white and get them out of Asia. The Allied nations also contributed heavily to this international race hatred by way of actions and inaction. None of the Allies would take measures to provide relief to Jews trapped in Hitler's inferno. So we talk about the Holocaust and everything that was going on, but the Allied powers did nothing other than the regular fighting the war to stop them, but they didn't actually go in and try to save any Jews until the very end, right? So they let it happen and let it carry on. They also rejected efforts to revise immigration restrictions, to grant asylum, to also consider rescue attempts or provide emergency aid to those who were being slaughtered. Well, I'll keep reading. Heroic actions from Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg saved lives of tens of thousands of Jews in Hungary by issuing special travel permits. So remember that name. And that is Raoul Wallenberg. Let me make sure I get it right. Yes, Raoul Wallenberg. Religious sects such as the Catholic and Protestant Christian Church leadership also remained silent. They just let this stuff go on. Stalin himself, who was an anti-Semite, that means he didn't like Jews, so he was a part of the Allied powers. So he fought alongside America and Britain and China. So he was the head of an allied nation, but he didn't like Jews either. So they kind of looked at it. They didn't care what Hitler was doing. And many U.S. and British officials did not care about the racial problem. When the Battle of the Pacific began, the United States press junkets released propaganda that displayed racial stereotypes of Japanese people. So we talk about Joseph Goebbels in Germany being the propaganda person or the minister of propaganda and creating these racial stereotypes. But they were also doing stuff like that in America. Racial, they've been doing it. You look at the old cartoon from back in that time, Warner Brothers. You look at how they characterized black people, but of course we were fighting Japan. Then you look at how they were characterizing Japanese people, and you had hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Japanese Americans here on soil who were Americans. Some immigrated from Japan. Some were second, third generation after their people integrated over, but they were born here on the soil, so they were Americans. They just were from their nationality or the country of origin of their people was just Japan. So they were technically Japanese Americans. by putting out that type of propaganda, that's kind of, you're kind of spitting in the face of people who are American loyalists. They just happen to have Japanese uh, ancestors, right? Um, Similar attitudes by the West were revealed with reference to non-white allied nations as well, despite that the fact that they were fighting side by side. So they even, these allied powers even hated the people they were fighting side by side with against the Axis nations. Um, Even though China and India were allies, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa all blocked immigration by their nationals during most of the war because of the color of their skin. Sound familiar, right? I guess these were those countries. What else? When passing through Africa, United States military commanders continued to refer to people by racial slurs, and we know that main racial slur that is American, as apple pie, that they always use, right? And among other things. In the United States in February of 1942, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 or 9066, authorizing the exclusion, removal, and detention of United States citizens of Japanese origin. So what I talked about before, those Japanese citizens, those American citizens who happen to be of Japanese descent, who were living in America, they were American loyalists, but they were now being made to move away from militarily classified zones and be put in internment camps. We'll talk about that. More than 100,000 Japanese Americans were forced out of their jobs and homes, then herded to relocation centers or concentration camps. Now, of course, they weren't exterminated like they were doing in Germany, but it's still, there has to be a question of the constitutionality of making any citizen or non-citizen move, or not be able to live a certain place, or round it up. This led to the constitutional challenge of Executive Order 9066 by Fred Korematsu in the famous Korematsu case, where the Supreme Court of the United States applied strict scrutiny to that executive order, and they still held that it was constitutional. And of course, that there was a split decision, 6-3, by the United States Supreme Court. But they held that the actions of President Roosevelt and his executive order were constitutional. They applied strict scrutiny, and it still passed them. It's still essentially found that it was constitutional. Of course, years later, they talked about the Korematsu case, and they said, it's not. It shouldn't have been constitutional. It was racist. So it's not necessarily the brightest moment for the United States Supreme Court in their history. At the same time, you had blacks in South Africa who were simultaneously going through apartheid. So South Africa was also an allied nation, but they were treating the blacks, who actually outnumbered the whites probably 100-1. They're going through an apartheid system, which is essentially racial segregation, or Jim Crow, just in another language. It's apartheid. The claim by Allied powers that they were engaged in a universal crusade for human rights, while at the same time flagrantly violating some of those very rights both at home and abroad, rang loudly, revealing a glaring difference between their words and their actions. The Axis powers did their best to draw attention to this hypocrisy. Of course they did. Germany is, telling black troops on the ground there, hey, you're over here fighting for America, and you can't even drink out of a water fountain in America, right? Why are you here fighting us when you should be fighting them? It's your country. So, of course, this anti-America, this hypocrisy sentiment was always displayed and vocalized. Criticisms of the Allied powers forced the Allied powers to confront the similarities as well as the differences with their adversaries, and thereby to acknowledge their hypocrisy. United States Vice President Henry Wallace admitted openly that the country could not honestly campaign for human rights around the world and at the same time deny the right to vote for millions of Black Americans. The first lady of the United States at the time, Eleanor Roosevelt, said the nation cannot expect colored people to feel that the United States is worth defending if the Negro continues to be treated as he is now. Right. So Eleanor Roosevelt, who's a little bit different than her husband, was more of an ally for human rights, particularly racial advancement. So she's way more of an ally. As a matter of fact, the pictures of her, she actually toured and visited black colleges. She hosted Mary McLeod Bethune and other Negro women at the White House. There's actually a picture of her coming to North Carolina A&T. So of course it was called A&T College back then. But the pictures in the A&T archives of First Lady Roosevelt actually visiting our campus here at A&T. Gunnar Myrdal asked, and he asked, how could the country oppose the racial policies of the Nazis and fascists with such vehemence abroad, yet support them so vociferously at home? Myrdal conducted a wartime study entitled "An American Dilemma: The Negro Problem and Modern Democracy." So Gunnar Myrdal is an important figure to kind of know as well. Because of this striking hypocrisy, individuals, non-governmental organizations, and some governments fighting in the crusade of the People's War turned to the task of developing visions and drafting proposals on the subject of international human rights. Now, Crusaders and proposals. This is actually the third part. I'm sorry I didn't tell you that we had moved on to the second portion, the second breakdown of the chapter. We have war. The first one we talk about war, genocide, and self-reflections. Then, this is the second part. I'm sorry. This is the second part. Crusaders, visions, and proposals. The second subsection of the chapter. The first elaborations of visions of human rights during World War II came from individual crusaders rather than governments. Building on the inspiration and the efforts of the League of Nations, they saw the war as a struggle against totalitarian regimes characterized by their complete disregard for human life and liberty through aggression abroad and dictatorship at home. H.G. Wells, very important to know who that is. H.G. Wells, a prominent British utopian writer. He launched a public human rights campaign, drafted a Declaration of Rights, formed a committee of well-known citizens to help attract notice and secure the willingness of the Daily Herald, a newspaper in London, in Britain, to publish a series of articles under the title of The Rights of Man. He sought to make it international, though the widespread distribution throughout widespread distribution throughout 40 countries. So he tried to get his publications out there. He spoke and corresponded with many world leaders, the Roosevelts, Dorothy Thomas, who was American female journalist, Jan Mazarek, and Edward Beneš of the Czech Republic, Chaim Weizmann and Jan Smuts of South Africa, Gandhi and Nehru of India, and also several Chinese philosophers. So he was trying to reach out to people all over the globe to spread the word. He also did a lecture tour throughout the United States. Through this process, Wells learned much about the relationship between human rights and duties, and about the importance. The importance of incorporating different philosophical traditions into any broad vision of international human rights. So he kind of got it. Like, for us to talk about international human rights, it can't just come from us. We have to kind of talk collectively among the globe about what human rights looks like. Then we had H.G. Wells. Then you had non-governmental organization contributions. You had the American League of Nations Association, led by James T. Shotwell, who had also served as a delegate at the prior Paris Peace Conference. You have the Atlantic Charter Society of London. You had journalists such as Clarence Street, who published Union Now, a proposal. It urged all democratic nations to unite on behalf of the rights of man. You have the movement of the Federal Union. In 1940, they published a pamphlet entitled How Shall We Win? Proposing an international charter of freedoms for all people. You have the Catholic Association for International Peace, who also um, uh, took part and gave contributions. Then you have the International League of Rights of Man. This was later called the International League for Human Rights. You also had the World Citizens Association, founded by legal expert Quincy Wright. The British Labour Party made contributions. J.L. Byerley of Oxford University proposed an international Bill of Rights. Benez of Chile, he actually lectured in exile. There was a national conference of Christians and Jews that had input as well. Jacques Maritain published Les droits de l'homme et la loi naturelle. In other words, the rights of the natural rights of man, essentially in French. Roosevelt commemorated the first anniversary of the Atlantic Charter by declaring that all the continents of the earth have united to form a great union of humanity. Now, such broad declarations of principle and proposals for bills or charters of guarantees did mark steps in the right direction, but they didn't always possess precision in terminology, sophistication in concept, consistency, or agreement on ends and means, right? So we know this is what we want, but how are we going to do it? How's it going to be written? What's the language going to, not language as far as like foreign language or but what are the words going to be, right? For some, they were still the words were still too abstract and unspecific. Some believed it was necessary to make generalities of these visions more specific in solving problems. Indigenous peoples and colonization. This is one issue that you had people that wanted to hear more verbiage about that and wanted to be more pointed and definite. W.B. Du Bois and George Padmore of the Pan-African movement. You had Nkrumah of Gandhi. Nkrumah of Ghana, Ezekiel of Nigeria, and Amy Jacques Garvey, who wrote for the Negro World and the Africa publications. You had NGOs such as the Universal African National Movement, the Council on African Affairs. You had Harold Moody and his League of Colored Peoples they proposed a charter for colored peoples, claiming the right of self-determination. You had military victories by Japan over Western white powers kind of stripped away the facade of that Western white military superiority in Asia. So Asia's attitude started to change. Even though Japan was an opposing side, they were part of the Axis powers. They were kind of kicking Europe and America's butt for a little while, right? So in doing that, it kind of had the effect of creating a pride of those who were in Asia. To say, hey, these people can be beat. Europe and America, they can be beat, right? And so it provided an inspiration for independence. So they were thinking at the end of this war, they have to respect this, right? You had Subhas Chandra Bose of India, Bao Mao of Burma, Jose Laurel of the Philippines, and Sukarno of Indonesia. They were all activists motivated by the Japanese military success. Even though Japan was an enemy, them succeeding essentially kind of gave people a hope, like, hey, at least we'll be, no matter what happens, we'll be respected as a people. You had racial problems as well. Raising the issue of race abroad elevated it at home. You had the Aborigines in Australia, Indians and Inuits in Canada, blacks in South Africa, and the Maori in New Zealand, among many others, wanted to know how the proclaimed principles of human rights would apply to them. You have the Institute of Pacific Relations. And also during 1942, the Congress on Racial Equality, or CORE, who was very active in the civil rights movement 20 years later, they launched their first political action campaigns. The NAACP launched its Double V campaign. That means double victory, victory abroad and victory at home. They launched that campaign. You had specific proposals, including the right to vote, equal protection, federal anti-lynching laws, and Justice Department intervention, the elimination of Jim Crow laws, and an end to colonial possessions and desegregation of the armed forces. So it's crazy, as American troops are fighting, they are segregated. So we're all fighting the Germans who are trying to take over the world, and they're led by a crazy man. But we're crazy because we're segregating our troops. So these men can't even die beside each other, right? The next, we have women's rights, and these were people that wanted to speak up. Not only did females suffer whenever civilian populations were attacked in this total war, but they also contributed heavily to volunteer activities. They contributed as part of the workforce because all the men were off to war, the women had to get up and now become a part of the workforce. They had to make bullets, make guns, make ammo, help build these planes, and help build the war machine. And there were some women that actually participated in military service and armed resistance against occupation forces. Mongolia, Dominican Republic, and the French provisional government in Algiers all extended the right to vote to women during this period of time. Ding Ling's visions of also had visions of liberating women in China. The United States embarked on a campaign to encourage women to enter the workforce in the name of patriotic duty. So if you've ever seen the pictures of the woman with kind of the bandana around her head and her sleeves rolled up, though that propaganda came out during World War II. In other words, they wanted women to get up and go out and join the workforce so that the army machine or the military machine could kind of keep going, right? In other words, we need tanks, we need bullets. A lot of the men are gone, so we need you here to help us in building this war machine. The women also played a significant role during the war as advocates for the rights of children. Of course, no one's going to speak out for children, so of course the women did. There was a National War Orphans Shelter Association in China that sought to provide immediate assistance of food, clothing, and refuge for children. Non-governmental organizations in the West devoted to the welfare of children, including many based on religious belief, took similar action in the face of need. You also have the Inter-Allied Conference of Educational Experts, the Pan-American Child Congress, and the U.S. Children's Bureau that also proposed some form of a children's charter addressing the rights of the child. Next, you have you have what we call the class and caste argument. FDR's New Deal social legislation that kind of attacked and changed the class structure and caste, or I would say the class structure in America, because a lot of people who weren't working were essentially now part of the workforce, right? It actually created a black middle class in certain urban areas. Australia and New Zealand spoke about how the war was being fought on a moral issue to extend justice and the rights of all mankind to economic and social justice. So there were a lot of people looking at this war as an opportunity, depending upon the outcome, to also extend social and economic justice. You have Mahila at Marshka. Let me make sure I got it right. At Mariksha Samiti in India, who held out a vision of eliminating the great disparities between the castes. So the caste system in India, which had been around for probably thousands of years at this point, They wanted to dismantle it so that people could have social mobility. Um, In 1942, the Beveridge Report in Britain argued that economic and social security should be the reward of service and sacrifice, and proposed the right of all citizens to have a decent level of subsistence through family allowances, disability benefits, national health insurance, old age pensions, and minimum wage. This report came to serve as the conceptual foundation of the modern welfare state. Next, we have the promise of protection and freedom from fear. Masses were victimized by wartime disruption, dislocation, um, made all extensive by the weapons of modern science. Graphic accounts and photographs of the displaced, huddled human beings in pain from starvation, exposure, devastation, and illness from around the world move humanitarian activists to consider their responsibilities and render aid. Private groups, religious charities, and the Red Cross rushed to provide relief, but they were, of course, overwhelmed and undermanned. And 44 nations agreed to create the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, described as the first and most fruitful international organization to emerge from World War II. They sought to provide food, build hundreds of hospitals, prevented epidemics of diphtheria and cholera, and cared for an estimated 1 million displaced persons. They pledged that they would never use relief as a political weapon and never make distinctions because of race, gender, creed, class, or belief. Individuals and non-governmental organizations devoted even more effort to promoting visions of international human rights. So this was a push to kind of, uh, I guess, give way or given for the world to kind of recognize human rights, right? So you had all these organizations that were saying, this is the time is now. You had the Commission to Study the Organization of Peace, composed of scholars and foreign policy experts. They released a report entitled Human Rights and the World Order, insisting on the necessity of protecting rights across national borders. You have the International Bill of Rights Committee of the 20th Century Association. They published an International Bill of Rights and Permanent Peace Concordance. And representatives from 47 colleges and universities throughout the United States submitted a proposal for an International Bill of Rights. You had Hirsch Lauterpacht. He was a famous expert on international law of that time, and he began his advocacy for human rights with a public lecture at Cambridge University, and then published proposals in an International Bill of Rights of Man. Okay. In Latin America, you had Ricardo Alfaro, who worked with other lawyers in the Inter-American Bar Association to articulate a vision of international human rights as part of the post-war world order. You had the American Law Institute under the guidance of William Draper Lewis, who formed an advisory committee that began work in 1942 on an extensive effort known as the International Bill of Rights Project. Representatives from the United States, Europe, Canada, Latin America, and China were there. In 1944, they released their Statement of Essential Human Rights, which was a report which articulated the vision of individual rights, including not only civil and political rights, but also social and economic rights, and made it an explicit duty of states to protect these rights. The International Labor Organization sought to add its voice to this groundswell of support for human rights. Under the leadership of Walter Nash, its members from 41 countries enthusiastically endorsed what they called the Declaration of Philadelphia. It included a conscience of mankind and a people's peace. This whole movement, this involvement of individuals, and non-governmental organizations became a vast movement of public opinion that grew in force and scope as the war rolled on. So, of course, as all these atrocities are going on, people are realizing this is, we have to do something about this at some point. We're essentially in this war because there was a lack of recognition for human rights. So we have to make sure that human rights are thought about post-war, right? So the question now arose, and the question was how the protection of human rights would be enforced um, across the world. So the question of how protection of human rights will be enforced plagued every one of these visions emerging from World War II. So they knew what they wanted, right? But the question was, how do we enforce it? How are we going to enforce this? There was the commission to study the Organization of Peace in its 1944 report entitled International Safeguard of Human Rights. It emphasized that change could begin only if people and governments first acknowledged the intimate connection between human rights and world peace. In other words, what this means in a nutshell is that you're never going to have peace if you don't have human rights. So in other words, if humans aren't equal, if they don't have rights, there's no such thing as peace. So you may not have any active war, but if there's someone being held down, that is not peace, right? So if you can't advance human rights, then you're not going to ever advance a world peace. In other words, there'll be more wars, right? So this study also took deliberate international action to implement and safeguard those rights. They proposed to convene, and this commission to study the Organization of Peace. They proposed to convene a United Nations Conference on Human Rights without delay. Establish a permanent commission on human rights to develop standards and methods of protection, to recognize the right of victims to petition that body, and to develop effective means of enforcement. So these were smart people and experts getting together to try to see how can we enforce human rights. The report pointed out the fight to retain sovereignty as a major hurdle. So we're hearing the same language. These countries want to retain sovereignty, which means we're our own country. We don't want anyone outside of our borders telling us what we can and can't do. That was always that's essentially that power lust that's always going to be in that has at least at the end of World War I and even at the end of World War II, which we'll discuss. That sovereignty question has always been something that stands in the way of the progression and the enforcement of human rights worldwide. So the report pointed out that the fight to retain sovereignty was going to be a major hurdle, as it is what allows states to claim special privilege of domestic jurisdiction and to hide within a culture of impunity, and meaning that, they were able to hide because they weren't going to be punished. They could do what they wanted to do to their people without punishment. That regarded any criticism about abuses of rights as an unjustifiable interference into their international affairs. So what that means is that the victims thus had to rely on their own government to provide legal redress for something that most of the time they did, right? So victims had to rely on their own government, the most likely source of the abuse in the first place, for the protection, and could not look beyond its own borders for help. The commission vowed that hiding behind sovereignty should no longer be tolerated, and declared that no nation may be insulated and wholly a law unto itself in the treatment of its people. The acceptance or rejection of this vision would be determined by the very claimants of national sovereignty, and that's the nations themselves. So these are just ideas that are coming out of these meetings, right? Whether or not they were going to be adopted at the end of the war is another question. Human rights versus national sovereignty and post-war planning. Now, this is the third subsection of the chapter. And that's what we kind of just talked about. That was kind of the closing of that section. But human rights versus national sovereignty. We're going to hear this again and again and again. And this is one of those. So national sovereignty has always been the barrier that keeps international human rights from being able to be enforced internationally, right? So that's why they've always made this argument that this our country. We know we know what human rights are. Let us enforce them. They don't want anyone outside the borders coming in and telling them what to do or taking over, because they want to stay in power. Uh, the many visions of international human rights generated during World War II presented Allied governments with an unanticipated and serious dilemma. The visions allowed Allied powers to differentiate themselves from the Axis powers, but they also created a troublesome mirror that reflected their own abuses of rights. It raised dangerous expectations that might not be met, and also potentially threaten their own power and claims of national sovereignty. Um, there were times during the war when the Allies were enthusiastic about advancing international human rights. It sounded good. You had the Atlantic Charter and all this good stuff, right? Um, and you had the Atlantic Charter and the Declaration of the United Nations. But then the question began or kind of arises as to, okay, now how are we going to enforce it? To enforce it, that means we're going to have to give up some sovereignty and give up some power. Are we willing to do that? Right? There were many times during the war when other statements and actions, however, revealed a very different direction. Even though you had the Atlantic Charter and the Declaration of the United Nations, all this good stuff that looked good on paper, and I idealistically was a good thing. There were other statements and actions that revealed that they were actually headed in a very different direction. When pressed, most of the Allied leaders noted that the statements in the Atlantic Charter and the Declaration of the United Nations only represented goals, rather than legally binding agreements that might jeopardize national interest and sovereignty. So, of course, that now is the situation now where it's all about. We have the Atlantic Charter and the UN, but that was just advisory, right? That it wasn't legally binding. We were just that was a goal, something we want to go for. But of course, because we don't want to give up power, we're not going to enforce it yet. Okay, allied governments refused to take serious action that might threaten their colonial empires or protect indigenous people. So they didn't want to give up the empires as well in the colonies. They didn't want to assist the Jews caught in Hitler's Holocaust, modify their immigration restrictions, release those interned solely on the basis of their race, or change domestic policies of segregation. The government reluctance was often supported by its citizens as well. So, of course, in America, there was a reluctant, of course, America was a part of that. The Allied powers who didn't want to give up sovereignty, right? Um, it also became a big political argument, because, of course, to get votes at this time, the American people didn't want to hear about America giving up sovereignty, right? So it became a very political push. If you want to get reelected, depending on what your title was, whether it was president of the United States, state senator, or congressman, of course, staying in power meant you had to kind of also do what the people wanted you to do. And of course, America at that time, you had blacks that couldn't vote, so they didn't have a political voice. So pretty much the only voice you had was that of white people, white men specifically, who of course didn't want America giving up any sovereignty and furtherance of human rights. So sometimes that's an example of the actions of our government being a reflection of those who vote for the government, right? Those in, of course, America's a democracy. So those who are in the majority kind of, setting the tone for what everyone has to go through. So there was a political aspect of it. Let's see. Tensions between human rights advocates and those unwilling to surrender national sovereignty revealed itself in the post-war planning process. So there was no better time or no time when we could really see this difference than when we got to the post-war, where it's now time to plan how the world would act and be afterwards. Roosevelt authorized the Advisory Committee on Post-War Foreign Policy with the Subcommittee on Political Problems, which was chaired by Sumner Welles. And Sumner Welles, of course, in history, you don't hear a lot about him, but he's actually kind of an unsung hero. He was really an advocate for human rights, and he didn't get a lot of he never gets a lot of notice or even applause for what he did. Actually, he kind of walked away and was forced to resign. So they kind of made him almost look like he was dishonorably discharged, not from military service, but just from the public eye. When it really wasn't that way at all. Of course, at that time they didn't see him as being an awesome person, but now hindsight being 2020, when we're looking now, we see the Sumner Welles was actually an awesome person. But Wells was a fervent advocate for international human rights, and the subcommittee under his direction turned its attention to the relationship between security, peace, justice, and human rights. The special subcommittee on legal problems, which is also a part of this committee, was the first drafting group for the post-war planning and was also tasked with considering the possibility of an international Bill of Rights. They formulated a set of rights that they thought would be universally respected in a formal statement of principles. They consulted many legal and advisory documents from the United States as well as other countries. That means they looked at the United States Constitution, other constitutions of other nations. At the end, and they declared that the end of the document would read as such: "These human rights shall be guaranteed by and constitute a part of the supreme law of each state, and shall be observed and enforced by its administrative and judicial authorities without discrimination on the basis of nationality, language, race, political opinion, or religious belief, in any law or constitutional provision to the contrary notwithstanding." The critical difficulty with this draft became the language "shall be observed and enforced." So, if you're going to create some type of international document that says "shall be," says what any country shall do, that almost means that, of course, now we're telling another country what to do, and then the question kind of arises of whether that country is going to let you tell them what to do, right? In other words, are they going to give up sovereignty? Um, Legal advisor DeWard Sandifer noted that the problem is implementing the guarantees contained in the Bill of Rights. Words and phrases are one thing, but implementation is another. The issue is national sovereignty. Sandifer thus recommended that a bill be promoted without any provisions of enforcement, reasoning that it would be the least complicated means of putting the bill into effect. So what he wanted to do was create this international Bill of Rights and only put it out there kind of as an advisory document with pretty much no enforcement. So in other words, to not hurt anybody's feelings and to not push them away from wanting to have peace and be a part of this charter. He decided that we shouldn't put anything in it that is enforced. That means that it's going to be enforced. In Britain, members of the territorial subcommittee knew the complicated questions would soon arise over border adjustments, the desire of victors to hold strategic possessions, and the promised right of self-determination to indigenous people in colonial empires. And no one had more colonial empires, I believe, than Britain. Britain even had stuff across the ocean. So you talk about place in Africa, you're talking about Jamaica, and a lot of islands that were under essentially British colonial rule. So the question is, are we going to give that up? So we already have this we already have sovereignty we don't want to give up, but we also have vested interests, right? We have things we own but don't want to give up. They also knew that most of the imperial powers were also military allies necessary for defeating common enemies, and were not all interested in giving up colonial interests and national sovereignty. So they also didn't want to piss off like their allies by saying, hey, we're going to do this charter and you got to give up some power, because you don't want to lose an ally in the middle of a war, right? We're about to push crazy Nazi Germany out. So we, and and Japan. So if we're going to do this, we got to continue to work together. If we're going to continue to work together, we kind of have to walk on eggshells, and not do anything that's going to alienate or piss off any of the allies. The underlying question is, how do we limit sovereignty? This led to most human rights provisions not having any enforcement language, as what happened in America with Sumner Welles and DeWard Sandifer. The same thing was going on in Britain. The question has always been sovereignty. U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull and Sumner Welles had two different opinions, and they butted heads, right? So this is kind of a example of how during this time when they were trying to create, this or plan for this post-war world, there were differences of opinion, and it kind of got ugly, and this is where it came out. Hull, who was the Secretary of State, believed in protecting sovereignty and thought that it was unrealistic to expect other countries to surrender any amount of sovereignty. Wales, on the other hand, was described as an idealist that believed that an international Bill of Rights was both possible and enforceable. The governments and their officials rarely speak with the same voice, so there was a butting of heads. As a matter of fact, they described Wales as being, someone that's kind of a fairy tale guy. He's talking about this fairy tale notion of a international a Bill of Human Rights that's going to be enforced because we're going to all give up sovereignty, and that just, to them it wasn't realistic. Of course, now the fourth portion and the last portion of the chapter, the last subsection of the chapter, is the opposition of the great powers. So at this point, now the war is wrapped up, or is about to wrap up. Not looking too good for Germany. America is in a bloody war in the Pacific with Japanese, and it's getting ugly at this point. So they're kind of planning, like, if we're gonna win, let's get together and kind of plan this thing as countries. What are we gonna do? The wrenching struggle of World War II forced most nations into a dramatic realization that they must find solutions on an international scale. Traditional national borders, geographical barriers, and reliance on their own resources simply could no longer protect them. Roosevelt said himself, "Our own well-being is dependent on the well-being of other nations far away." Without the combined, end quote, of course, without the combined might of all the members of the Allied powers, they each would fall victim to aggression. So they needed each other. Without collective efforts of the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, they each would be completely unable to provide humanitarian aid and helpless victims. Without such newly created multilateral institutions as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, they each would be at the mercy of the global market forces over which they individually could have no control. So they needed each other. There was kind of this relationship where these powers needed each other. We needed to be a world community, right? So we could be a world community when it comes to money and need, but not when it comes to enforcing human rights. So it's kind of weird, right? Think about that. Okay, the absolute necessity for cooperation is assumed even greater urgency when Allied successes in the Pacific, Soviet advances westward, and the Anglo-American D-Day invasion of Normandy in 1944 brought the war closer to a point of end. So in other words, the Axis powers got a good head start, but now the Allied powers are catching up and taking over. Germany was weakening because they were fighting the war on two fronts, so they were getting smashed in, like they were getting sandwiched from both sides by the mighty Russian army. And Hitler was kind of not helping because he was a bad wartime decision maker. He made terrible war decisions. So he was called through his command. He was causing the losses or putting them in bad situations. So they were losing to both. They were losing both on the Western Front from now the allied nations of America, of the United States. You got France and the French resistance, and then you got Britain. They've now stormed the beaches of Normandy. They're coming in and they're kind of pushing Germany to the east, and then from the east, you have the Russians who now have the Red Army, and they're coming and they're destroying Germany. And part of the problem is Germany tried to fight a war and attack Russia at the wrong time of year. So Russia is one of the coldest places on earth. If it's from October to probably I'll say April, you don't know what you're going to get. Coldest place on earth, and now you have German soldiers trying to attack Russia. And in many cases, Russia didn't even fight. They said, we're just going to stand there and let them freeze to death, to the point where it was so cold out there. The mechanized division, the tanks and stuff like that, the tanks weren't working. So Germany was trapped on all sides. It was a highly ill-advised tactical move to try to attack Russia at that point in time. So a lot of German soldiers starved and froze to death, and it was an easy win for the Russians. They just took them over. So it was getting ugly for Germany. Japan they were losing, and we hadn't even dropped the atomic bomb at this point, but we were kind of taking control of the war. So at this point, because now the tides of the war are turning, the great powers among the allies decided that it was very important for them to meet and draft a charter for a new international organization that would become known as what we call today the United Nations. Representatives from the United States, Britain, and Russia and China thus met from August to October of 1944 at Dunbarton Oaks on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. here in America. Here they sought to negotiate the design of an organization that would replace the League of Nations, which failed, but they wanted to actually go through and create something that was akin to the League of Nations and it actually be successful and live and make it. They reached an agreement over the concept of what they call the four policemen, that's what Roosevelt coined as the four policemen, or the idea that the four nations with the most military power would act as guardians over all the rest. No possibility existed for a successful international organization unless these four countries supported it. The preliminary charter of the United Nations therefore provided for a powerful security council that the four great powers would dominate. So they always had a representative on the Security Council. They designed a considerably weaker General Assembly composed of representatives of all other nations. And then they had an Economic and Social Council and an International Court of Justice. They firmly agreed that the principle of national sovereignty would be firmly respected. So they're trying to, but you don't hear them saying anything about human rights, right? But they did say something about making sure that national sovereignty was protected. 3 out of the 4 great powers also agreed to oppose any meaningful provisions on international human rights or racial equality. So this meeting, you think, okay, they're going to create the UN, which is United Nations. It means unity. They're going to come in here with human rights. But in this meeting, they said, nah. Of course, there was one country that was there that had all the black and brown people of the world on its back, and that was China. We'll talk about them as well. Despite all of the rhetoric and promises of a people's war, the decision makers at Dumbarton Oaks resisted anything in the charter that might give the United Nations authority to actually enforce rights. So it looks like the United Nations was still there. It kind of was doomed to kind of fail or not be effective from an outset. Now, as I mentioned before, there was one country that was there out of the 4 that was there that was essentially representing the interest of all black and brown people globally, right? China was the only exception to this, and they announced in advance that they would be willing to give up any sovereign power as may be required in order to help the organization accomplish the task of the world. So that meant they walked into the room, and it's probably because they knew these four countries, greedy countries, weren't going to give up sovereignty. So they wanted to kind of look like the only country in the room that wasn't a jerk, right? Out of the four countries. So they walked in saying, and even before saying publicly, that we are willing to give up any sovereign power we have in the advancement of human rights and the advancement of this organization called the United Nations. Fully aware of the fate of the Japanese proposal. Fully aware of what happened when the Japanese proposed the same thing, and wanted to carry the mantle of racial equality into the first meeting at Paris. This is back in at the end of the First World War. They knew what happened, and they knew that the same thing would probably happen here, but they went for it anyway. But fully aware of what happened, China declared their firm determination to again or to raise the issue of race and human rights. The Chinese representatives at this meeting were Wellington Koo and H. Kung. So Wellington Koo was also kind of a part of things in World War One. He was kind of an outspoken person on human rights in China back then, and now at this point, he's now a representative from the Chinese delegation at this Dunbarton Oaks meeting. The other great powers opposed China's proposals regarding race and human rights and voted to keep any worthwhile mention of human and racial rights out of the United Nations Charter. The United States had recently forced the resignation of Sumner Welles, who, remember I talked about him being an American hero that's kind of unsung. So that they forced the resignation of Sumner Welles, who was a champion of human rights, and instead they sent his political rival, the person who they kind of butted heads with, Cordell Hull. And he was a champion of national sovereignty. So it was all about protecting what America has and national sovereignty. So when they sent this guy, of course, they're not coming to advance any human rights at this point. So of course, there were also other people that kind of didn't even want China there, right? The British didn't. The U.S. served, and this is because the United States served as China's vital benefactor of military and financial assistance in wartime, and they sponsored the diplomatic status in post-war planning. So China was kind of married to America even back then because, of course, we talk about China now, but at that point it was, America had put a lot of money into China being able to protect itself in a war against Japan. So America kind of pulled the Chinese puppet strings in this situation. Therefore, the United States invited China to the meeting for that reason only. Winston Churchill had some he didn't want them there because, of course, he was a noted racist. He did some great things in history, but we all know his views of people of color. But he said Churchill didn't even want Japan to be there, and he dismissed them as a world power. He called them an F word vote on the side of the United States. In other words, they were there as kind of a chump or for the United States. So he used language that is politically incorrect to gay people in describing China. Of course, there was no political correctness, but we all love Winston Churchill, right? Then we have Russia and Britain. They did not support any statement about human rights because of their vast colonial holdings and the human atrocities that Russia had already been committing. The Brits didn't want to surrender any colonial power or the right to self-determination to any of its colonies. It didn't want to give freedom away. As a matter of fact, Jamaica didn't even gain its freedom from British colonialism until like the 60s. It was like 20 years after World War II. So Britain eventually gave some of its colonialism up, but at this point, they weren't willing to do so. And then you had Russia and Stalin. Of course, they didn't want to have any type of world police or United Nations policing human rights because Joseph Stalin, they were partaking in human rights violations. Stalin's dictatorial regime in Russia forced collectivization, meaning we're going to take whatever you have for the government. We don't care. Ruthless purges, state terrorism, and the Gulag, which is like the Russian torture jail or something like that. They can never possibly survive any serious human rights scrutiny. So if there was a United Nations enforcement of human rights, if there was some type of enforcement, Russia would be in trouble, right? Um, so of course that's why they didn't want there to be any enforcement. Wellington Koo, once again, like the representative of China, he bitterly complained about the fact that the other three countries refused to adopt human rights as a part of the language of the United Nations Charter. He made his and China's frustrations public, but he still voted to adopt the charter for fear of alienating the allies. So they still wanted to be a part, so he voted with them. But they publicly made a statement that they didn't agree with there not being any mention of human rights, or if there was a mention, but it was like way in the back, and didn't mean anything. The draft charter that emerged from the great powers emphasized more what we call realpolitik, or more about politics as opposed to anything idealistic. And it revealed their intention of creating something that they could control. So it was all about control. The big three, normally, even the book starts calling them the big three and not the big four, even though there were four countries there. The big three saw the defense of their own security, the protection of their own interests, and the enjoyment of the fruits of their victory of World War II as more important than the creation of an international organization to maintain world peace. They plan to dominate the powerful Security Council with their permanent membership and vetoes capable of thwarting any action against themselves or their interests. So they essentially were policing themselves, which no country's ever done. They also designated a weaker General Assembly in which states would sit, but would be confined to only discussion rather than action. Matter of fact, FDR described it as just being a place for smaller countries to come and blow off steam and talk crap, but they had no power. So it we'll make them feel good by letting them come and talk crap and come and express their displeasure, but outside of that, that's all. They permitted the only reference to human rights and fundamental freedoms to appear within the confines of the general economic and social cooperation. That's almost like a footnote at the back of the charter, and it had no enforcement power, so it was kind of a mention of human rights and not even a definite statement of human rights, what they were, who they applied to, or anything. The three or four great powers obviously had little understanding of or appreciation for the power of visions of human rights generated during World War II. The human rights activists worldwide were outraged at the lack of advancement of human rights during this prime opportunity. So this is a First World War where they squandered the opportunity, and now there's a whole Second World War where we have 11 million people that died just by the Holocaust alone. We're not even talking about the soldiers, right? And you had more civilians that died in this war than soldiers did. So all these people died. These people that weren't even soldiers or enemy combatants, and now you have this United Nations at the end of this war, which is a prime opportunity for them to do the right thing and advance human rights, and they still fail to do so. So of course, the human rights activists were outraged. It seemed as if all the sacrifices of the People's War were all for naught for those that were promised a certain advancement. So you were promised things by being a part of the war, and once again, for a second time, 20 years later, none of the promises that came through. Some countries who were left out of the UN discussed that they would not join the UN or sign on the dotted line due to not being given the chance to take part in conferences and not being able to willingly accept the general lines and the proposals of Dunbarton of the big three at Dunbar, or big four, but big three at Dunbarton Oaks. Those who had been excluded up to this point were now fully determined that they would not remain passive in the face of great power opposition, or silent on the subject of human rights as the time approached for a more broadly based international conference designed to create a people's peace. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is chapter 5. I know it was a lot. We discussed a lot. My mouth is tired. Needed some water, but that is chapter 5. So you guys take care.